Hello and welcome back to HateWatchers for another monthly review roundup. Today we're discussing everything we watched in the month of June. From movies to TV shows to sporting events to just about anything, these roundups give us a chance to revisit media we've reviewed on the channel or discuss things that we haven't talked about before. For this June roundup in particular, we're going to keep things rather brief simply because of how packed our schedule has been in recent weeks. Without further ado, let's get into it. And as always, there may be minor spoilers for everything discussed herein, but nothing that will ruin the film or show. Starting off on the big screen, as is tradition, we only got to one major release this month in Horizon and American Saga Chapter 1. This Kevin Costner produced western is his baby that's kind of at the center of his departure from the final season of Yellowstone. The true story is more complicated than that, and we plan to discuss the collapse of Yellowstone in a separate video later this year, but many believe Costner couldn't make time for the powerhouse TV show due to his work on this massive undertaking. Chapter 2 of the saga is set to release in August of this year, and Costner plans to make parts 3 and 4 depending on the reception of the first two chapters. Because of this structure, one of the major problems with Chapter 1 is that it stands as essentially just an introduction to the setting, characters, and storylines, leaving us with little to nothing in the way of resolution at the end of this first 3-hour movie. Horizon features some gorgeous vista shots, and I think it does a decent job of transporting you to a different time and place, but there's a lot of disconnected storylines going on, and it can be hard to keep track of. We'll have a video talking more about the movie later this week, and we'll be here in August to see how the second chapter picks up the pieces left behind by the first. We were also supposed to get a remake or reimagining of The Crow in June, but that got pushed to August. June wasn't a particularly busy month for film releases. The Quiet Place Day 1 is the only other movie that comes to mind. We didn't watch it, but it seems to be decent based on the reviews. Moving from the big screen to the small, June was a pretty busy month for us with the release of The Acolyte and House of the Dragon. We're reviewing both currently, so you can check out our videos on those for a more in-depth analysis. But from a high-level perspective, it's particularly damning to have something like House of the Dragon running at the same time as The Acolyte. The same thing happened when the first season of House of the Dragon ran at the same time as Rings of Power. Hot D just makes those other shows look like child's play. In terms of a quality comparison, House of the Dragon absolutely buried the much more expensive Rings of Power in its first season, and in its sophomore outing, it's making The Acolyte look like even hotter garbage than it was to begin with. House of the Dragon, still without a foray into the Targaryen civil war we're all eagerly anticipating, is doing fantastic character work, using its great acting performances to keep you glued to the screen, even though the proceedings aren't particularly engaging on the face of it. The Acolyte, on the other hand, is shitting the bed like Amber Heard week after week. It was always likely going to be a failure, but the first 2 episodes weren't as bad as everything since then has been. Brought to us by a creator with the wrong priorities and storytelling, if you can call it that, and someone damn near the center of one of Hollywood's worst scandals of all time, The Acolyte is utter tripe. It's already steamrolling some pretty damn important parts of the established Star Wars canon, and they're not even done yet. The only thing I'll mention specifically about the show is in relation to the supposed Sith who was shown in the trailer and who revealed himself to the Jedi in episodes 4 and 5. I see online that some people are clinging to the fact that this character merely said that the Jedi might consider himself a Sith, but that doesn't mean he would call himself the same. The obvious problem with this is that Coyote-Mundi in The Phantom Menace, who just so happened to be in episode 4, said that the Sith haven't been heard of in a millennium. And some think that as long as this character doesn't get classified as a Sith by the end of the season, that this line's accuracy will be intact. The problem is that the entire point of that line was that the Sith were supposedly wiped out by the Jedi 1,000 years prior, and there's been peace, free of any significant threat from the Sith or any Darksider comparable to a Sith in all that time. If Coyote-Mundi in the original canon before this trash show reared its ugly head had been faced with what we've seen in The Acolyte, he would have said, "The Sith have been extinct for a millennium. But we did have this Darkside user 87 years ago who I was told about personally, and he called himself a Sith and he was desperate to take on a Darkside apprentice and he killed a shit ton of Jedi and escaped. Maybe the Sith are still around." There are very few ways that the show can still skirt around breaking that part of the canon, and I'd argue that none of them can be satisfying. One option is that Coyote-Mundi is involved in a cover-up of this Darksider's existence, but that would be even more damaging to the lore. To show the third highest ranking Jedi by the time of the Phantom Menace to be a Sith apologist. Another option is to say that these weird orange dust spores the Acolyte kept showing us on that planet was producing a hallucinogenic effect on everyone, basically falling ass backward into the old "it was all a dream" trope, which would be hilariously shitty storytelling. But after last night's episode, it doesn't look like they're going that direction. They look to be heading toward having every Jedi involved die and take the information with them, which still doesn't work, but we'll see. Anyway, The Acolyte has been a shit show that's pretty much exactly what Star Wars fans were afraid it would be. We're also watching The Boys, but we're only 2 episodes in, and so we don't want to share too much about the show until we get further in. The one thing I'll say is that this is not the same show as it was in Season 1. We'll have a video on The Boys coming up at the end of the season. Last up, we watched The Bear, which came back for its 3rd season, dropping all 10 of its episodes at once. We have a spoiler-free review for the season already up, and you should check that out, but Season 3 saw a surprising drop-off from the quality of the storytelling and the character work it built up in the first 2 seasons. There were a ton of flashbacks this season that fall completely flat, as they really do nothing to better inform us about the characters' personalities or how they'll now approach the new challenges they're facing. Everything we now know about the characters at the end of Season 3 we pretty much already knew at the beginning of the season. We didn't get any true character development until halfway through episode 10, and what little progression we got with the main story came at a snail's pace. Season 3 feels more like an extended, artsy epilogue to the events of Season 2 than it does a real season all its own. Which is disappointing because The Bear was pretty good up to this point. And that does it for everything we watched in the month of June that we had an aim at reviewing on the channel. We used this last segment to discuss what we've been watching for our own enjoyment or for research. We were able to run through a bunch of movies at the beginning of the month. Starting on the war front, we watched Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and the 2022 iteration of All Quiet on the Western Front. Platoon and Apocalypse Now are both classic Vietnam movies, and surprisingly I enjoyed Platoon more than Apocalypse Now, which is the opposite of what I expected. That's not to be taken as saying anything bad about Apocalypse Now. Both are incredible films. It's kind of funny that you had Martin Sheen in a Vietnam movie from 1979, and his son Charlie Sheen in another classic Vietnam movie 7 years later. All Quiet on the Western Front is also a great tale, following the story of a naive, idealistic young German enlistee heading to the front lines of World War I, who is just a shell of his former self by the end of the film. It's a pretty good war film, and it does a good job of portraying the hopelessness and the complete lack of gain that characterizes World War I. Just make sure you can watch it with subtitles on. Next up, we checked out a film called Dragged Across Concrete. With Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn headlining, we had hopes that this little heard of movie would be a small diamond in the rough. But instead, it was pretty much just all rough. There's some brutal violence, some decent one-liners, and some okay takes on modern society, but on the whole, the movie missed the mark. We watched Highlander, which was interesting but didn't quite live up to the admittedly high hopes we had for it. And we watched the new movie Hitman, which is on Netflix. Now don't let the title fool you. This is a rom-com through and through, with no action to speak of. It's based on the mildly interesting true story of a New Orleans man who would go undercover as the best hitman in the city to build cases against those seeking out his services. They spiced up the true story a bit, but at the end of the day, it's just another rom-com, and not a particularly good one at that. The last movie we watched for ourselves was Escape from New York. The interest in watching this movie was born out of nothing more than wondering for a few years where the scenes of Kurt Russell with an eye patch came from. I didn't come away from the movie with any interesting thoughts, other than maybe that the movie really shows its age watching it now. I will say that it was cool to see Kurt Russell play the character that Solid Snake from the Metal Gear franchise was based on. Last up for shows and movies, we watched the MacGruber series that came out in 2021. Yes, MacGruber is dumb comedy, but it's some of the best dumb comedy around, and MacGruber has been one of our favorite dumb comedy movies since we first saw it. The show doesn't live up to the movie, but it has its moments, and it's still an enjoyable, fast watch on its own. The very last thing we watched in June was the end of the NHL Playoffs. The championship series became a lot more interesting than it looked after the first 3 games. I think Florida deserved the cup, and it'll be interesting to see if the Oilers can keep this core group of guys together after another failed run. And after 31 years of no Canadian teams winning the Stanley Cup, what's a little more waiting in the grand scheme of things? Don't at me, Canadians. And that is everything we watched in the month of June. Let us know in the comments what you thought about anything we discussed here, and as always, let us know about anything you've been watching. Thank you for taking pride in putting storytelling before representation during Pride Month with us today, and we'll catch you on the next one.